Let me tell you about a summer in northeastern Oklahoma, the summer of 2022, when the Tallgrass Prairie of Osage County turned the color of old paper by the middle of June, and every cattle rancher between Pawhuska and Fairfax was standing at the tailgate of his pickup with a phone in his hand, doing the same arithmetic. Grass hay had climbed past $280 a ton and was still climbing. The pastures that were supposed to carry cattle through August had given out in July. Farm ponds had cracked open at the edges. The forecast promised storms that fell apart before they crossed the Kansas line. And every rancher in the county was making the same three calculations. How many head can I hold on to? How many do I have to sell before the sale barn is flooded? And how deep in the hole will I be by the time this thing breaks? Every rancher in the county except one. Her name was Marguerite Halvorsen, though everyone in Pawhuska had called her Margie for 40 years, and she was 63 years old that summer, a small, thin, weathered Swedish-blooded woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight knot, and pale gray eyes that had seen more than she ever told. She ran 190 head of Hereford cows on 780 acres of rolling limestone prairie, about 11 miles west of town. And while every other outfit in Osage County was culling deep and hauling feed from 3 states over, Margie Halvorsen was doing something the neighbors could not stop talking about. She was walking through her east pasture every morning at first light with a burlap sack over her shoulder, picking up long brown seed pods off the ground and dumping them into the feed bunks. And her Herefords were fat. Now here is what you need to understand about Margie Halvorsen before I go any further. She was not a woman given to speeches, and she was not what anybody in Osage County would have called a modern operator. She drove a 1989 Chevy pickup that had been her husband Halvor's before he died. She wore the same faded blue denim jacket every fall for 8 years running. She did not run a website. She did not go to conferences. And when the extension agent from Stillwater came out to talk about rotational grazing, she poured him coffee, listened politely, and did not change a single thing about how she managed her ground. But she had one habit that set her apart from every other rancher in that country. She read. In the evenings at the kitchen window that looked out over the pasture, under a yellow bulb that had been in that same fixture for 30 years, she read old agricultural bulletins and dusty conference stenographs and handwritten field notebooks, most of them left behind by her father-in-law, a man named Sven Halvorsen, who had been the county agricultural extension agent from 1934 until 1968. And in one of those bound papers, 28 years before that terrible dry summer, Margie had read something that changed the way she looked at trees. It was a leather folder, faded, cracked at the spine, tied shut with a piece of hemp twine gone dark with age. Inside were the stenographic notes from a livestock conference held in Stillwater in the fall of 1936, at the tail end of the Dust Bowl. Sven Halvorsen had been a young man then, 26 years old, sitting in the back of that lecture hall with a fountain pen. And on page 41 of his notes, he had recorded the testimony of a rancher from the Texas Panhandle named Bertram Coyle. Coyle had kept his cow herd alive through 4 straight years of drought on the seed pods of a tree that most people in his country would have taken a chainsaw to if they had the time. The honey locust, Gleditsia triacanthos. Sven had underlined 2 sentences in Coyle's testimony with his own hand, in ink that had faded to a soft brown. One mature thornless honey locust tree will drop between 100 and 200 pounds of high-protein feed in a single autumn, and it will do it whether it rains that year or not. Margie read that leather folder in the winter of 1993, 3 months after Sven had died at 92 years old in the little back bedroom of the ranch house. She was 34 then. Halvor had just inherited the operation from his father, and Margie had gone out to the machine shed to clean out the wooden crate of Sven's papers, and she had found the folder on top, wrapped in oilcloth. She read it that same night at the kitchen table. She read those 2 underlined sentences 3 times. And then she did something that no other woman in Osage County was doing. She started planting honey locust trees. Not a lot at first. 15 trees the first spring. Thornless nursery stock she ordered out of a place in southern Missouri, planted in a rough grid across a corner of the east pasture. Halvor thought it was a curious project. He did not stop her, but he did not help either. And Margie planted 15 more the next spring, and 15 more the spring after that. By the summer of 2022, when the drought hit, Margie had 440 honey locust trees standing across her ground. spaced 40 feet apart in a pattern she had worked out over 28 years of trial and error. The oldest of them were nearly 30 feet tall, dropping over 200 pounds of pods every October. The youngest, planted after Halvor's death, were only 8 years old but already producing, and that was where her cattle were fat, while the rest of the county was selling off half their herds at the Pawhuska sale barn for prices that broke the men and women who had raised them. Because what Margie Halvorsen had done, quietly, over 28 years, without ever asking anybody to believe her, was build a feed system that did not depend on rain. She had built it a tree at a time, in the spring, on her knees, with a shovel and a bucket of water and a small wire cage to keep the yearlings from rubbing the young trunks. She had built it while everybody in Osage County called her a hobby rancher who was letting good grass go to trees. And in the summer of 2022, when the rain stopped and did not come back, the neighbors who had laughed for 28 years started driving slow past her fence line in the evenings after chores, and none of them laughed anymore. The honey locust, Gladitsia triacanthos, is a native North American legume tree that fixes nitrogen in the soil and produces long seed pods rich in sugars and protein. Historical bulletins from the Oklahoma Agricultural and Mechanical College, now Oklahoma State University, documented its use as emergency livestock feed during the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s, when ranchers in Texas and Oklahoma kept cattle alive on locust pods after grass and hay supplies collapsed. Modern silvopasture research has confirmed pod yields of 100 to 200 pounds per mature tree per year, with feed values comparable to oats. Part 2. Now let me back up. Because to understand why Margie Halvorsen's neighbors laughed at her for nearly 3 decades, you have to understand what Osage County looked like in the 1990s. And you have to understand what people in the Oklahoma Tallgrass thought about a small woman with an idea. Osage County is old cattle country. 2,300 square miles of rolling limestone hills covered in blue stem and Indian grass. The largest remaining piece of true tallgrass prairie in North America. The families that ran cows on that ground had been there 4 and 5 generations, and they ran it the way their grandfathers had run it. Native pasture in the summer, prairie hay put up in July. Cull the open cows in the fall. Do not plant trees in a good pasture, because a tree in a good pasture is a sign you have let something get away from you. Ranchers in Osage County spent good money and good weekends fighting eastern red cedar out of their grass, not putting trees in on purpose. And when Margie Halvorsen started planting honey locusts in the spring of 1994, on purpose, in rows, in her best pasture, word went around Pawhuska in about 4 days. The first man to say something to her face was Delbert Rausch, who ranched the section on the north side of the Halvorsen place. Delbert was a big, loud 60-year-old with a round red face and a laugh that could carry across a fence line. And he pulled his pickup up to the mailbox one afternoon in the spring of '95 and asked Margie what in the world she thought she was doing planting trees in a pasture. Margie told him. Delbert laughed for close to a full minute. Then he said, "Margie, honey, you are going to spend the rest of your life pulling those things out." And he drove off shaking his head. That was the friendly version. The next week it was Wyatt Kroll, who ran the sale barn in Pawhuska and knew every rancher for 100 miles. Wyatt came by on a Saturday morning and stood in the east pasture with his hands on his hips and looked at the little wire cages around Margie's saplings and said, "Margie, I have been in this business 30 years, and I have never seen a Hereford turn into a squirrel." And he laughed too. That line went around Osage County like a joke told at a wedding. For years afterward, men at the coffee shop in Pawhuska would ask if Margie's cows had grown tails yet. And Margie, who came into town for groceries once a week, would sometimes hear it as she walked out with her sack. She would not answer. And here is the part I want you to understand, because this is the part that separates Margie Halvorsen from most of the people I have known in my life. She did not argue. She did not try to convince anybody. She did not walk into the coffee shop and pull out Sven's leather folder and start reading from Bertram Coyle's testimony. She just kept planting. 15 trees a spring, 28 years running, 440 trees. She kept a small green notebook in the glove box of the Chevy, and every fall she walked the east pasture and weighed the pods off 10 sample trees, and wrote the numbers down in her small, tight handwriting. And she did not tell anybody about the notebook either. Halvor knew, of course. Halvorsen was a quiet man 5 years older than Margie, and he was the one who had helped her carry the wooden crate of his father's papers in from the machine shed in the first place. He had watched her read the leather folder at the kitchen table that first winter, and he had watched her order those first 15 trees from the nursery in Missouri, and he had never once told her to stop. He never planted a tree beside her, but he never asked her not to plant one either. When Delbert Rausch made his joke at the co-op, Halvor did not defend Margie. He just nodded once and paid for his fencing staples and left. Margie used to say quietly, when it was just the two of them at the kitchen table, that Halvor had understood something the neighbors did not. He had understood that Margie was not doing this to be right. She was doing it because she had read something that Sven had written down in 1936, and she believed Sven. And she did not need Delbert Rausch or Wyatt Kroll to believe her too. Halvor died on a Sunday morning in April of 2001, at 57 years old, of a heart attack in the yard while walking out to check a heifer. Margie was 42 years old and suddenly alone on 780 acres. Delbert Rausch came to the funeral and told Margie that if she needed to sell out, he would give her a fair price for the ground. Wyatt Kroll came and offered to broker the herd at the sale barn with no commission. Margie thanked them both. She did not sell. She went home from the funeral, and the next spring, on her own, in her 43rd year, she planted 15 more honey locust trees. By 2010, the oldest trees were 16 years old and dropping their first serious crops of pods. Margie started feeding pods to her Herefords in October, just as supplement, scooped out of the burlap sack into the wooden bunks she had built herself along the north fence. The cattle went for them like children going for candy, and she wrote it down in the green notebook, pounds per tree. Total pounds. Which trees produced heaviest? Which trees had underperformed? Which years the pods came early, and which years they came late? Halvor's father had written in that same steady hand in 1936, and Margie wrote in the same way now, quietly, honestly, without expecting anybody to ever read it. And she kept planting 15 more trees every spring, and the neighbors kept laughing. But somewhere in there, around 2015 or 2016, the laughter started to change. It was not louder. It was quieter. It was the kind of laughter that happens when men are not quite sure anymore whether the joke is on the person they are laughing at or on themselves. Delbert Rausch stopped bringing it up at the coffee shop. Wyatt Kroll stopped repeating the line about squirrels. There was a stretch of 3 or 4 years in there when nobody in Pawhuska said anything at all about Margie Halvorsen's trees. And Margie planted her 15 every spring. And the older trees kept getting taller, and the pods kept getting heavier. And if you drove past her east pasture in October, you could see her Herefords with their heads down, working the ground under the canopy. But nobody stopped, and Margie did not tell. Silvopasture is a land management system that integrates trees, forage, and grazing livestock on the same acreage. Research from Oklahoma State University's Kerr Center and from the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry has shown that well-designed silvopasture systems can increase total forage production by 15 to 30% while providing drought resilience and shade for livestock. Honey locust is one of the most studied silvopasture species in the southern Great Plains, valued for its deep taproot and its ability to produce high-protein pods without irrigation or annual replanting. Part 3, and this is where the story turns. Let me take you back to June of 2022, because that is when the rain shut off. The spring had looked good. Grass had come on strong in April, and by the middle of May, every rancher in Osage County was walking his pastures and thinking it was going to be an easy summer. And then the rain stopped. The first week of June went dry. The second week. The third. The forecast kept promising storms that dissolved before they crossed the Kansas line. By the end of June, the tall grass on the high ground had started to cure. By mid-July, the low draws had cured too. By August, the whole county was the color of a paper sack. The stock ponds were down. The wells were slowing. And the temperature that August broke 105 degrees for 11 straight days. The hay market went crazy. In a normal year in Osage County, good prairie hay ran about $120 a ton. By August of 2022, it was $280 a ton and rising, and you had to haul it out of southern Missouri or eastern Kansas because there was none to be had in Oklahoma. The sale barn in Pawhuska was running special Saturday auctions to move all the cattle that people could not afford to feed anymore. Wyatt Kroll told a reporter from the Tulsa World that he had never seen so many good Hereford cows going through his ring in his whole career. Most of them were going to feedlots in the Texas Panhandle at prices that broke the ranchers who had raised them. Now, Margie Halvorsen had 190 Hereford cows on 780 acres, and the same drought was hitting her. Her native grass pastures were as dry as anybody else's. Her ponds were shrinking, but she had 440 honey locust trees standing across her ground, and those trees did not care about the drought. Their taproots were 40 feet down, drinking from a water table the drought had not yet touched. Their leaves were still green in mid-August, and by the end of September, those trees had dropped somewhere between 36 and 38 tons of pods onto the pasture floor. 38 tons. In a year when hay was $280 a ton, and every rancher in the county was selling off cows he had spent 15 years breeding up. Margie calved out normally that fall. She fed pods as her main supplement through October and November, mixed with what little prairie hay she had put up earlier in the summer. Her Herefords went into winter in a condition score of 5, which is the number you want. Her neighbors' cows, the ones who still had cows, went into winter in a condition score of 3, which is the number you do not want. Margie did not sell a single head that year. Delbert Rausch sold 62% of his herd. Wyatt Kroll told everyone at the sale barn that Halvorsen had figured something out and nobody had noticed. The first man to come to the house was Delbert Rausch himself. He came in December, driving that big diesel pickup of his, and he pulled up at the gate and honked once. Margie walked out in her jacket and Wellington boots. Delbert rolled the window down, and he said, "Margie, I owe you an apology." That was the whole speech. Margie nodded and told him to come inside for coffee, and she poured coffee for both of them at the kitchen table. And Delbert asked her to explain the trees to him from the beginning. And Margie did. She went and got Sven Halvorsen's leather folder out of the cedar chest in the back bedroom, and she untied the twine, and she set the folder on the kitchen table between them, and she read the 2 underlined sentences from Bertram Coyle's testimony aloud in her small, clear voice. And Delbert Rausch, who was 68 years old and had ranched that ground for 40 years, sat there and listened. By January of 2023, the phone at the Halvorsen place was ringing 4 or 5 times a day. Ranchers from as far as Ponca City and Bartlesville were calling to ask about the trees. Extension agents were calling. A researcher from the Oklahoma State University Range Science Department drove up in the middle of an ice storm to walk the east pasture and take soil samples. A reporter from the Tulsa World wrote a 2-page feature that ran that February with the headline, "The Woman Who Planted Trees." And Margie, who had never gone to a conference in her life, was invited to speak at the winter meeting of the Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association in Oklahoma City. She did not want to go. Her son called from Tulsa and told her she had to. He said, "Mama, there are ranchers out there right now who are losing everything. And if what you have in that folder can help even one of them keep the ground, you have to go." So she went. She drove down to Oklahoma City in the old Chevy with the leather folder wrapped in a clean flour sack cloth on the passenger seat and the green notebook in the pocket of her denim jacket. She stood up in front of 300 cattlemen in a hotel ballroom, and she did not give a speech. She untied the twine on the leather folder. She read the 2 underlined sentences from Bertram Coyle's testimony in Sven Halvorsen's ink from 1936. Then she opened the green notebook and read the pod yield numbers from every year going back to 2010. She read the pounds per tree, the tons per acre, the feed cost savings. She read for about 35 minutes in that quiet, unhurried voice of hers. And when she was done, there was a silence in that ballroom that people who were there still remember. And then the 300 cattlemen stood up and applauded. Margie Halvorsen stood at the podium in her denim jacket with the green notebook shaking just a little in her hand. And she did not smile. She just closed the folder, tied the twine back around it, nodded once at the room, and walked back to her seat. Her son said her hand was cold when he took it under the table. She did not speak for the rest of the evening. She just drove home that night in the old Chevy with the folder on the passenger seat. And when she got back to the ranch house at nearly midnight, she went out to the machine shed and stood there for a long time by herself in the cold. And then she came inside and went to bed. The 2022 drought was one of the most severe in recorded history for Oklahoma and the southern Great Plains, affecting more than 90% of the state and driving the national beef cow herd to its lowest level in 70 years. Feed cost pressure during that year drove renewed interest in silvopasture, drought-resilient perennial feeds, and long-lived tree-based fodder systems such as honey locust and mulberry. Oklahoma State University's silvopasture program reports that inquiries from cow-calf producers rose more than fourfold in the 2 years that followed. Part 4. Let me tell you what happened after Oklahoma City, because that is the part that matters most, and it is not what you would expect. Margie Halvorsen went home from that meeting in January of 2023 and did not change a single thing about how she lived. She did not start a consulting business. She did not sell seedlings. She did not go on any more speaking tours. When her son asked her why, she said something on the phone that he wrote down that same night because he knew it was the whole story. She said, "Honey, I did not plant those trees to be right. I planted them because a man wrote something down in a stenograph in 1936, and Sven believed him, and I believed Sven. And now other people have to decide for themselves whether they believe me. That is not a thing I can do for them." But something did change in Osage County that year. Slowly at first and then not so slowly. In the spring of 2023, Delbert Rausch ordered 50 thornless honey locust trees from a nursery in southern Missouri and planted them along the north end of his home pasture, on the very ground where he had first laughed at Margie 28 years before. Wyatt Kroll planted 30 on his own ground. By the spring of 2024, that Missouri nursery was sold out of thornless honey locust for the first time in its history. And most of the orders were coming out of Oklahoma. By late 2024, there were more than 2,000 honey locust trees standing in pastures across Osage County that had not been there before the drought. Every one of them traced back through one conversation or another to the 440 trees on Margie Halvorsen's east pasture. Margie kept planting her 15 trees a spring. She kept the green notebook in the glove box of the Chevy. She kept reading the old bulletins in the evenings under the yellow bulb. And when young ranchers started showing up at her gate, which they did more and more as that first year went on, she would walk them out to the east pasture and show them the trees and answer every question they asked, patiently, one at a time. But she never once said, "I told you so." Not to Delbert Rausch. Not to Wyatt Kroll. Not to anybody. In the summer of 2023, Margie's granddaughter Clara came out to spend 2 months on the ranch. Clara was 17 years old, the daughter of Margie's son in Tulsa, a quiet, dark-haired girl with her grandmother's gray eyes, and she was thinking about studying agriculture at Oklahoma State. She helped Margie every morning that summer. She walked the east pasture at first light with a burlap sack and picked up pods. She weighed sample yields for the green notebook. She fenced 2 young trees that a bull had rubbed loose. And on her last evening at the ranch in the middle of August, Margie took her out to the east pasture in the long slanting light and they walked among the trees. And Clara asked her grandmother what the lesson of it was, what she was supposed to learn from the story of the honey locusts. Margie thought about it for a while. She picked up a pod off the ground and turned it in her hand and looked at it. And then she said something in that quiet voice of hers that Clara wrote down in a small notebook of her own that same night. She said, "Clara, most ranchers in this country lose everything they have because they do exactly what everybody else is doing. When everybody is doing it, then when it stops working, everybody is broke at the same time, and there is nobody left to help anybody. The only way to be safe in this business is to do something that nobody else is doing, and to be right about it. And you cannot know if you are right unless you read the people who came before you and think about it for a long time by yourself and are willing to be laughed at for 28 years. Clara did not know what to say to that. She just nodded, and Margie put the pod in the pocket of her denim jacket, and they walked back to the house in the long light. Margie Halvorsen died on a morning in May of 2024 of a stroke at 65 years old in the kitchen of the ranch house where Halvor's father had died before her. Clara had come out for the weekend and was the one who found her. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her head down on Sven's leather folder open in front of her, one hand still resting on the page with Bertram Coyle's testimony. The twine loosened on the table beside the folder. Clara did not move the folder for 3 days. At her funeral, in the Lutheran church in Pawhuska, Delbert Rausch spoke. He was 70 years old by then, thin and gray, and he stood up at the podium in his best jacket, and he did not read from anything. He just spoke. He said that Margie Halvorsen had planted 440 trees in a pasture, and that every one of those trees was still standing, and that a great many of the ranchers in that church were still ranching because of them. And then he said one more thing. that I want to end this story with, because it is the whole meaning of it. He said, Margie never told any of us we were fools. She just planted the trees. And when we needed the trees, they were there. And that is the finest thing I have ever seen any neighbor do for the rest of us. Clara Halvorsen inherited the ranch. She was 18 that summer, and she left Tulsa and moved out to the ranch house in June. She kept every one of her grandmother's Herefords. She kept the old Chevy in the barn, the green notebook in the glove box, and Sven's leather folder tied shut with hemp twine in the cedar chest. And every spring, in April, on the anniversary of the week her grandmother first read Bertram Coyle's testimony, Clara drives out to the east pasture with a shovel and a bucket of water and 15 honey locust saplings on the tailgate. She plants them one at a time, on her knees, with a wire cage around each young trunk. 15 trees. One for every year her grandmother lived on that ground after Halvor died. And when she is finished, she stands up and looks at the 440 older trees spread out across the pasture. And she does not say anything. She just goes back to the house and puts the shovel away. Honey locust trees planted in the 1990s are now reaching peak productivity. And long-term silvopasture research plots at Oklahoma State and the University of Missouri continue to document their value as a drought buffer for grazing operations across the southern Great Plains. The most successful silvopasture systems in the region today share 3 characteristics observed on the Halvorsen Ranch. Long planting horizons of 20 years or more, patient tree establishment integrated with existing cow-calf enterprises, and a willingness to hold a position for decades without external validation. The lesson these systems teach is simple, and it is old, and it takes a lifetime to learn.